Great. Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining. The agenda, how we're going to cover this is first do some level setting, make sure that we have a common understanding, a little review of Secure Shell. Not everyone on the call may be fully familiar with the protocol and how it's used and how the Secure Shell keys play into the authorizations. And then given that basis, we'll move into how those authorizations can introduce risk and compliance exposures in the IT environment. Moving on from there, we'll talk about a process for remediating it, information on how you can actually get started, determining the potential impact of these issues in your environment, and moving forward on how to do something about it. And then lastly, we'll talk about the resources that both SecureIT and SSH Communications Security and other resources out there that you can use to help you get going. So just to get started, Secure Shell primer. It's Secure Shell. It's a cryptographic protocol for remote login, remote command execution, and securing file transfer. It's really it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife. You can do a lot of things with Secure Shell. I'll indicate some of that in the next slide. The protocol is an IETF standard, and it basically comes built in open source versions on Unix and Linux systems, and you can get both open source and commercial implementations for both on the Unix and Linux platforms, as well as for Mac, Windows, and mainframes. So it's pretty much available for all the systems that you have out there, and it's very widely used. And essentially, its function is to provide authentication, confidentiality, and integrity for data in transit. So it provides a secure authentication protocol, and then once the connection is made through Secure Shell, provides confidentiality of the communication itself and integrity, so that you know that data is not being altered in transit. And its most common implementation of the way people actually use Secure Shell employs a public key-based authentication. There are other authentication methods available, but the public key system is really what's most widely used. It's really where we're going to focus on today in our webinar. So the popular uses of Secure Shell, it's to provide a secure login to remote systems. So an administrator who needs to log in and perform some functions on a remote system can do so securely with Secure Shell, as opposed to Telnet, which is an unsecure login. It provides file transfer services. So again, that's to make sure that file transfers are held confidential and are initiated through an authenticated process. Enables secure command execution on a remote host. Through a login, you can just execute specific commands. Provides a backup and copy support. It can do tunneling, so effectively it can act as a VPN. Application tunneling is commonly RDP, remote desktop protocol, is used is secured through Secure Shell. And so, given this wide availability of functionality, particularly for systems administration, it's really the kind of workhorse of systems administrators. And which is often not commonly seen is the wide use for automated machine-to-machine processes. So this, in many instances, particularly in certain kinds of operations, like in financial institutions, also in federal government, there are a lot of automated machine-to-machine processes, backups, file transfers, etc., which take place, without human intervention. And Secure Shell is really good for that because the public key-based authentication enables these processes to be initiated without human intervention. So let's talk about the Secure Shell user keys, because this is really the crux of the whole identity management issues that we're covering today. So a user key consists of a key pair, and it's both with the pairs consists of a private and a public key. Now the private key is an identity key on the client, and it links the holder of that key to a corresponding public key, but it does not have an explicit link to a user. And we'll hear more about this in a couple of minutes. The public key is an authorized key for a particular user on a secure shell server. And what it does is it establishes that the holder of the private key is authorized to connect as a particular user. So essentially, that authorization allows the holder of the private key to log into a remote system, assuming the identity of the account where that public key was authorized. And as I mentioned a minute ago, keys are used for automated processes, enabling authentication for scheduled and automated file transfers and other tasks where user interaction is not possible. And also for interactive connections, where typically for remote systems administration and application administration. And as the graphic shows here, the automated process is typically initiated through key pairs that are not protected. There's no passphrase required, and that's essentially to enable the automated aspect of the connection, so you don't need a human to enter a passphrase or a password. And for administrative connections for interactive users, there is the option to require a passphrase to unlock the use of that private key on the workstation. So how do these keys actually get into place? Generating and authorizing the keys. There's basically the user on a workstation can generate a key pair with a specific command, keygen, and that produces a private key and a public key. And to allow the connection, that public key is copied to the destination server account authorized key file. So there's an account on the with an SSH server, and the public key is installed in the authorized key file so that the holder of the private key can log in as that user. And so the access is allowed if the source user's home directory on the source host contains the private key that matches the public key on the destination host. So that's the picture of it. So it's relatively straightforward, and often this is really done in a manual fashion in lots of implementations. And so these keys create trust relationships, and that can be a one-to-one. So there's a workstation user with a private key authorized with one copy of his public key authorized on one server, or that individual can have many authorizations off of that single key pair with multiple copies of the public key being installed on these servers. And then you have the many-to-one, where you may have multiple administrators who have access to a given particular server. And so they would have, actually in this instance, that would indicate there's multiple copies of the private key with the authorized public key on one server, and then the many-to-many authorizations. One thing that this graphic isn't really bringing out is a graphic of automated processes where instead of having workstations there indicated in the graphic, you'd actually have servers. So you would have servers authorized to access other servers to perform backups, file transfers, and other forms of processes. And those are all enabled by those key-based trust relationships. Now, that you can put some forms of security controls on these keys. So there are the option to create key restrictions. A user on an SSH server has a separate authorized key file containing the public key to connect, and those that particular file can specify certain restrictions. There can be command restrictions that says the holder of the private key is allowed in, but they're only allowed to execute specific commands. There can be source restrictions that not only does the person logging in have to have the corresponding private key, but it can only come from a specific host. And then there's forwarding restrictions limiting the use of protocol tunneling. So there is ways to implement specific restrictions that limit the scope use of access to the servers, but what we see in many cases that these access restrictions are really not implemented because it does add some complexity. So oftentimes that can add to the risk, because although you may have set up a key pair to authorize a specific activity, the key pair may in fact enable a much broader set of activities than is intended. So I'm going to touch on some risk and compliance exposures, sort of give you some scenarios where how this key-based setup can create risks. And then after that, I'll pass it over to Greg to take us through more of the compliance issues and then get into the remainder of our agenda. So here's a scenario here where Bob is authorized to log in as root to a production server. That, Bob's the administrator of that server. And so he creates a key pair and adds the public key as root. But in this case, because he already has authorization, he can create a second key pair under his root with root privileges and install a second public key to that production server. He makes a copy of that private key, moves it to his personal workstation so that it gives him the ability to log in and do some work from home or from a different workstation. He may decide it'll be handy if one of his coworkers can fill in for him, and so he'll provide that coworker with another copy of that of the private key that he created to kind of make his job a little more convenient, although none of those trust relationships were actually authorized or intended from the get-go. And Bob may he shares his private key with Bill. In this case, Bill leaves the company and keeps the private key. That's one element of risk that can happen. Or Bob's computer could be hacked and the private key taken, and now the attacker now has root access to that production server. So this gives one element of how sharing of the private key or making copies, either known to the holder of the private key or not known to the holder, can introduce risk in the environment, because now there are these authorizations out there that were never intended and are not known about. And a perfect example of this was in the news fairly recently at a hosting provider where actually the perpetrator was arrested. This was an insider threat. This systems administrator had essentially put in private authorized keys onto 2,700 servers, giving that person access to each of those servers at a pretty high level. It may have been root access, and even after he was terminated. So he basically left he had given himself the ability to log into 2,700 servers at this hosting provider after he had been terminated. There's the scenario of transitive trust, where a systems administrator may be authorized to log in as root to a production server 1, but not production server 2. And then production server 1 has an authorization on production server 2 for an automated process, so for example, to initiate file transfers. And so that systems administrator now can initiate file transfers on that second production server through that using the trust relationship on production server 1. So again, that's an unintended escalation of privilege through that chain of trust. And a common issue that we've been seeing in a lot of environments that we run into is an issue of segregation of duties. In particular, business users have access to production servers, developers have access to development and test, and the intention is that there shouldn't be any cross-authorizations. Developers are only allowed to access their authorized servers. In fact, what we see is typically there can be leakage of keys from one environment to the other as images are moved across from development and test and production, and even vice versa, and as a result, there's authorizations that violate basic segregation of duties. And this is a very common scenario an area that we're brought into to remediate in the clients that we are working with. So some sort of summing it up, in a typical enterprise current state of affairs, there's a large number of secure shell keys that no one knows about. There's a dense mesh of key trust relationships throughout the network that is really, no one really has a full understanding of it. There's a lack of visibility as to who has access to what servers and as to who they are allowed to log in as on those servers. And a lack of records around the business purpose of each authorized key, whether it's needed or who is using it. And a lack of tools or methods to restrict key use, remove keys, regularly rotate keys. As Greg mentioned earlier, these are all effectively identities, and just like a username and password, the standard governance practices of updating them, making sure that they're still needed, etc., need to be applied to secure shell keys as they are to user logins. And just kind of summing up of a case study, one of the customers that we're working with, top 5 global bank, over 10,000 servers on the network, and what they found is 1.5 million secure shell user keys identified. And one of the key points here is that there were 15 times as many secure shell keys as login IDs. This is both a legacy of keys that have not been removed, but also the prevalence of all these automated processes that are enabled by secure shell keys. And so this turned out to be in violation of some basic risk and governance issues, and in fact, they had failed a SOX audit over the issue of segregation of duties, and this is why, of course, that we're working with them today. And this is not an uncommon scenario. This is actually fairly typical across the industry. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Greg and have him complete our presentation.
Okay. Now that Jonathan has given us a walkthrough of some of these concerns, I want to summarize them. If I can, there we go. This slide will help summarize the most significant security risks that Jonathan has talked about and get us focused on some compliance concerns. First off, since it's often difficult to identify who is using SSH keys, there's certainly a risk that keys could provide access that is not authorized or appropriate. In addition, individual accountability, which is a core principle of good security practice, is also lost. In addition, there's a risk that SSH keys could provide a backdoor of sorts that allows users to circumvent or bypass controls that are in place for restricting or auditing traditional logon IDs. Unless those controls for traditional logon IDs also address SSH keys, there's likely a significant gap in coverage. Frequently, SSH keys that are no longer needed, even those keys that are used by employees that have been terminated, or keys that have been copied or even leaked outside the organization or otherwise compromised, may be usable for extended periods of time. And it's also common to have keys that violate segregation of duties and cross security zone boundaries without anybody noticing that that's happening. It's also common for SSH keys to provide more access than is required. Typically, keys that are used only for specific commands or functions are actually configured to allow full command line access. This is commonly the case even when external parties are using SSH keys. The intention may be for those external parties to use their SSH keys only for a limited set of commands like file transfers, but in fact they may have a whole lot more access than that. And lastly, the complexities of SSH key-based trust relationships, especially transitive trusts, can allow security attacks to propagate throughout a network in unexpected ways. If an attacker is able to gain a foothold within the network, SSH keys can provide the access mechanism for the bad guys to expand and escalate their attacks throughout the network and ultimately reach the most critical servers. As we saw on that slide, a few slides back, that dense mesh of access with all those transitive relationships, it is quite likely that most hosts in a network would be reachable after going several steps down that process. In short, poorly managed SSH keys can have a significant and widespread impact on security. Oops, sorry, one too many. Let's take a moment here to consider some of the causes of these risks to link back to some of the things that Jonathan talked about a little bit earlier. First off, SSH identities are based on who has access to the private key. There is no direct connection of SSH keys to particular users. So that means that it's very difficult in order to tell who's actually using the key to connect. But there's another problem in that the keys by default are accessible to users in their home directories. The default configuration is for authorized keys to be stored within user home directories where obviously users can access those authorized key files and create new trust relationships. This essentially amounts to a self-serve provisioning model, and as you might imagine, anything that is self-serve can quickly deteriorate and get out of control. Jonathan described briefly some of the key restrictions that are possible in the authorized key file, things like command restrictions and source restrictions. And although those capabilities are provided by SSH, they're rarely configured. So this causes really the lack of use of a facility built into SSH for controlling access. And because that's not widely used, we have resulting risk. But more broader than that, it's very common for organizations not to apply standard identity and access management controls to SSH keys. That is the same types of controls that folks have had in place for years for traditional login IDs, things like a formalized provisioning process with approvals and justification of access, and processes to recertify access and remove access when it's no longer needed, and to periodically change credentials. These types of principles really should apply to keys just as they apply to login IDs, but that is not really done much in practice. And when you add to this mix of causes the fact that there are so many SSH keys in an environment and the complexity of the trust relationships because of the transitive nature of the trusts, this becomes a very difficult thing to manage even for organizations that attempt to do so. So now to put on our compliance hat, these types of problems that we've been talking about introduce some significant issues from a compliance perspective. Now, every organization is subject to slightly different compliance requirements, and some of those are shown at the bottom of the slide, whether NIST requirements for federal agencies or the common frameworks for controls like COBIT and ISO. Regardless of which compliance mandate an organization is required to meet, there is a common denominator, some common practices that all of those requirements have in common. And a few that relate to SSH keys are described at the top of the slide. Most obviously, there are general key management practices that are described in most compliance requirements. Things like the importance of protecting keys and rotating keys periodically. However, the real impact of SSH keys on identity and access management and compliance issues goes far beyond just those general key management practices. The other bullets shown on the slide are accounting for the very basics, the bread and butter of identity and access management controls. Things like the importance of provisioning new access only when it's required and when it's approved, to have individual accountability, the need to recertify access regularly and to remove access when it's no longer needed, and to have access controls that enforce segregation of duties. These are at the core of access control. However, as we've talked about over the last few slides, it is not possible to meet these compliance requirements without implementing controls over SSH keys. So now that we have a sense of how significant the security risk and the compliance issues are relating to SSH keys, I wanted to spend a little bit of time describing a remediation process. There's really two main steps for remediation. The first is the step to remediate the legacy keys. That is to clean up the mess that has accumulated over the years. And there's a fairly robust process for doing this. The first step, quite obviously, is to scan the environment to discover and identify all the existing keys that are in the environment and to merge them together to identify the existing trust relationships. As with anything, it's impossible to control unless you first have an inventory. Now, once that inventory is created, it's important to do a few things with it. Of course, all those trust relationships need to be reviewed to make sure that they are valid. And it's important to determine what the business purpose is for each of those trust relationships and to document that in an external inventory, basically creating the information about all those keys and what they do and the access that they provide. However, most organizations find that there's a lot of keys that they really have no idea what they do. And the next step is a key part in getting those keys under control. And that is to enable additional logging so that the actual usage of specific keys is tracked. That can enable the organization to tell which keys are being used and which ones are not. And if that usage is tracked over a sufficiently long period of time, then organizations can have enough confidence that unused keys can be safely removed without jeopardizing any production processes. So once all these unused, invalid, unauthorized, shared, or keys that otherwise violate security requirements, like crossing security boundaries or connecting development environments to production, then it's important that all of those keys be removed. And the last step, which is not to minimize its importance because it actually is very important for overall control of the risk, is to enable restrictions on keys wherever possible. Most important is the command restriction, especially on keys that are used by system and service accounts and that therefore do not require interactive access. Placing these command restrictions on the key greatly limits the exposure because then those keys can only be used for specified purposes rather than arbitrary commands at will. Now, in some cases, it may also make sense to implement source restrictions. For instance, if an organization has jump servers or things of that nature, but oftentimes source restrictions are feasible. Well, to elaborate a little bit on that first step, to scan the environment and to discover keys, really this requires a couple of steps. The first step is to identify all of the keys, both the identity keys on all of the SSH clients, whether they're on people's workstations or whether they're on servers for service accounts, system accounts, and then also to identify all of the authorized keys that exist on SSH servers. And once that's done, the relationship between those public and private keys can be used to link up these two sides of the equation, if you will, to identify the trust relationship between certain systems and certain users. Now, this information can be quite useful at a meta level because it provides a lot of useful statistics to summarize things like the total number of keys that exist or the number of keys that have access to the root account or to other sensitive accounts like service accounts. There's also some nifty things that can be done. For instance, identifying private keys that have been shared. That is, to have private keys, identity keys, that are stored in the home directories of different users. This is a situation that requires some action to prevent that sharing of keys, just like we don't want passwords to be shared. Keys should also not be shared, or there's just a complete lack of accountability. And actually, I've neglected to advance the slide so you could see some of these metrics that can be accumulated and provide a significant amount of information regarding the state of keys and the trust relationships throughout the environment. Well, once the legacy keys have been addressed, then it is important to have ongoing management controls in place. The first necessary step is to establish a centralized provisioning process, a formal process that will require approvals of keys and authorize key relationships before they are implemented. Now, in order to enforce this, it's important to remove that self-service access that folks have to authorize keys. And that is done by locking down the authorized keys file and moving them into secured directories. So typically this means moving them out of users' home directories and putting them in a directory under etc that is only accessible by root users. Doing this then means that only users with root-level access can provision new trust relationships, and it really serves as the only way to enforce that provisioning process that was described in the first bullet. As with anything that involves users, it's important to have a policy that identifies the types of things that are permitted and the types of things that are not for the effective management of keys. And unfortunately, it is necessary to continuously monitor the state of trust relationships and keys throughout the environment. Even after the authorized keys are locked down, there's a lot that could happen over time. Not only do keys no longer, not only do keys drop out of use from time to time, but there may also be abuse of privileges by root users to create new keys that might circumvent the provisioning process. Users may also copy their private keys onto systems that they shouldn't be doing. This type of activity needs to be monitored for on a regular basis so that those new keys that violate policy and the new relationships can be removed in order to ensure that the environment stays clean. And last but not least, it is important to rotate keys periodically. That is, to expire the old keys and to issue new ones if a key actually was leaked or remains in the possession of someone who should not have it. There's a definite end date when that access will be terminated. Now, these types of things that I just described in these remediation slides are not really rocket science. In fact, you might say that this really amounts to applying the same types of practices that have been in place for years on traditional logons and applying the same things to SSH keys. Now I want to switch gears a little bit. Now that we've talked about the problem and how that problem gets fixed, I want to make sure everybody has a sense of what you can do now to go back to see if your organization or your clients are impacted by the types of issues that we've walked through today. There's a series of steps, 4 steps that go in progression, providing more and more detail. The first step is to ask a few key questions regarding the types of controls that we've talked about. This is obviously a quick thing to do, to interview the folks in the know at your organization about how SSH keys are managed, to see if things like approvals are in place with a provisioning process, to determine whether the authorized keys are locked down, whether it's possible to explain the business purpose of keys, whether unused keys are periodically removed and keys rotated on a regular basis, and whether command restrictions are used, and other types of things, the controls that we've talked about elsewhere in this presentation. That's a good first step, but of course, in a sense, talk is cheap, so it's important to actually look at some data to see how things are actually set up in practice. Now, we would suggest doing a preliminary assessment on a sample of high-risk systems, and we would suggest looking at 3 different things. First, to look at the SSHD config file where the configuration parameters for SSH servers are defined. And there's several key parameters shown on the slide that will determine whether SSH user keys are supported in this implementation on the server, whether the authorized key file is stored in its default location or whether it's been moved to a secure location, and whether key-based access is permitted for the root account. Now, all 3 of these have obvious implications to the potential risk related to SSH keys, but that's not sufficient. So we also advise pooling the authorized key files themselves and first gathering some metrics to determine the total number of keys and the number of keys that have command restrictions or not, and the keys that provide access to the root account or to other sensitive accounts like system or service accounts. And besides gathering some metrics, we advise also to choose a few test cases, selecting a sample of critical users like those system and service accounts or the root account, and pursuing with the folks that are available to see if it is possible to identify the business purpose of that key and to determine who is actually able to use that key to connect. The proof is in the pudding, and this is really one of the key things to do to prove if the organization really has their SSH keys under control. And of course, if an organization cannot identify the business purpose of a key that has access to root or sensitive service account, and there's no sense of who's authorized to use that key or who has access to the keys to use them, that indicates a problem. Well, to take things to the next level, because after all that was just based on a sample, it's best to get some quantitative metrics that look at a larger number of systems. And in order to do that, you have to have some automation. Well, SSH Communications has a tool, the SRA tool, the SSH Risk Assessor. It's a free tool on the SSH Communications Security website that will examine all SSH servers and clients within a network and identify certain metrics about those keys and the trust relationships that are defined on those servers. So this is a way to gather more data and to provide an even more clear picture about the state of SSH keys and the potential risk that exists in the environment. Now, depending on those 3 preliminary steps, if it appears based on executing those preliminary steps that there is likely a problem with SSH key management, the last step is to do an exhaustive analysis in order to really determine the magnitude of the exposure. Now, SSH Communication Security has a nice set of tools, and SecureIT, we specialize in security assessment and audit work. We have some analysis methodologies that can help determine the definitive extent of the problem by looking at the security and compliance impacts, not in general, but for the particular issues that exist within the specific environment. Now, ultimately, what needs to be done, the bottom line question is, once you've determined that there's a problem, it's necessary to know, does that problem need to be fixed, and what's the most cost-beneficial way to do so? And this ultimately requires prioritization. And in order to do that prioritization, you have to have fact-based or you need to have facts so that fact-based risk management decisions can be made. And that's what this definitive assessment would provide. Well, there's several resources that will be useful for organizations to investigate the types of issues that we've talked about today, including all the risks that we spoke of and the remediation activities, and even some of these preliminary assessment steps that can be executed to determine the scope of a problem. There's a lot more information available both on SecureIT's and in SSH Communication Security's website in the form of white papers. In addition, I would strongly recommend that everyone consult an IETF standard. There's a draft IETF best current practices standard on SSH key management that is a collaborative effort of SecureIT and SSH Communication Security and NIST. And this is still a draft, so it's still being developed, but it has a lot of good information. It's probably the single best resource to get more information on this topic. And then there are also services available from SSH Communications as well as SecureIT to do the assessment and remediation activities. And the SSH Communications has a tool that will help automate the remediation process and really enables all those remediation steps that we talked about before. It's a nice tool, the Universal SSH Key Manager. And we can provide more information either about those tools or the services we provide, or more information about SSH key management in general. If you reach out to either Jonathan or I, and you can see our contact information on the slide. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rachel, see if there's any questions that we can answer in the remaining few minutes that we have.
Thanks, Greg. If anyone has any questions, there's a little chat box. There's also a questions box, so feel free to ask any questions and we can answer them online, or we can take them offline and get in contact with you later. As Greg said, you are more than welcome to email him or Jonathan, or just go to our website if you have any questions later on. I'll just wait 30 seconds to see if anyone has anything to ask. There's one. Oh, two.
I'll read out the questions, and I can't quite. Oh, yes.
What size key pairs are being used currently?
Greg, would you like to take that one?
You know what? The exact details of the crypto in place for SSH escapes me at the moment. Let me answer the question this way, though. The problems that we're talking about are not related to the core crypto built into SSH. The encryption is solid. You don't really have to worry about someone cracking the public key encryption scheme between the public and private keys. That is not really a concern. The concern is more about managing those keys and the implications that has for identity and access management. And if if you want to email me, I can look up that technical information and get back to you if that is still something that you're interested in.
Okay, thanks, Rick. I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I guess that's a good thing. If you do come up with any questions later, feel free to email Greg or Jonathan, or just go to our website in the Contact Us form. This webinar will also be available online, the recording, at www.ssh.com in the Resource Center. And if you want to share it with any colleagues or watch it again. Also, if you want the slides, please email Jonathan, and we will send them to you in PDF format. So you can share that, or just have them on file for if you need any information. But yeah, I think that about wraps it up. So thank you for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.